April 1201. 6 envoys ride into Venice carrying a shopping list. They want ships. Enough ships to carry 33,500 men and 4,500 horses to the coast of Egypt. Enough food to keep all of them alive for a year at sea. The Doge listens. His name is Enrico Dandolo. He is somewhere past 90 years old, and he is completely blind. He names a price: 85,000 silver marks. It is roughly twice the yearly income of the King of England, twice the yearly income of the King of France. And to build a fleet that size, Venice will have to stop being a trading city altogether. Every shipyard, every rope walk, every carpenter and caulker in the lagoon turned over to one contract for one client. The Republic accepts. 2 summers later, the army arrives. It is a third of the size it promised to be. The men who came empty their purses. Silver plate goes into the pot, jewellery, coins scraped from every tent in the camp. It comes to a little over half of what is owed. And the ships are already built. What follows is one of the strangest debt collections in European history. Within 2 years, an army raised to retake Jerusalem will sack the largest Christian city on earth instead. And when the accounting is done, Venice will hold 3/8 of the Roman Empire. It did not conquer that empire, it invoiced for it. This is Venice, a city with no farmland, no stone, no timber, no metal, no fresh water at all, beyond the rain it caught on its own rooftops and stored in cisterns beneath its squares. Every brick here was imported. Every loaf of bread was bought. And for the better part of 500 years, this was the wealthiest city in Europe. The men who divided the Byzantine Empire in 1204 did it on paper, in committee, the way a firm divides an estate. A quarter to the new emperor. The remaining 3/4 split between the French lords and the Venetians. 3/8 of an empire. Written down, signed. Venice took the harbour district of Constantinople. It took the shoreline of the Sea of Marmara. It took ports down the Greek coast, islands in the Aegean, anchorages the Adriatic fleet had wanted for 2 centuries. And when the island of Crete came up, the largest prize on the table, 1,000 kilometers of coastline sitting directly on the route to Egypt, Dandolo did not fight anyone for it. He bought it. The Crusader lord who held the claim was offered a better price by Genoa. Dandolo moved first. 1,000 silver marks, paid to Boniface of Montferrat, and Crete became Venetian for the next 465 years. A blind man, past 90, sitting in a tent outside a burning city, purchasing an island the size of a small country for what a wealthy merchant might spend on a house. Venice acquired its empire the way it acquired everything else. It negotiated, it lent, it subsidized, undercut, and waited. The fleet was the collection department. But an empire has to be paid for before it can be bought. And a city standing on wooden posts driven into a tidal swamp has nothing obvious to sell. So what exactly was Venice selling? The answer is sitting in the water all around it, and almost nobody looks at it twice. Begin with the ground, because the ground explains everything that follows. The Venetian lagoon is not land and it is not sea. It is roughly 500 square kilometers of shallow water, mudbank and marsh, most of it under half a meter deep, cut by a few natural channels and separated from the Adriatic by a thin chain of sandbars. Nothing grows here. Salt in the soil kills wheat, kills vines, kills orchards. The people who first came out here were not adventurers. They were refugees. Mainland Romans running from the Lombards in the 6th century, then running again, moving from island to island as each one silted or flooded or proved too exposed. Torcello was the first real city of the lagoon. In the 10th century, it may have held 20,000 people. Today, around a dozen live there, and its cathedral stands almost alone in a field of reeds, because the channel that fed it filled with silt and the marsh around it turned malarial. The survivors moved to the deeper water at Rialto, and they inherited a problem that would shape the next 1,000 years. They could not feed themselves. A farming town that has a bad year goes hungry. A town that grows nothing at all does not have bad years. It has a permanent structural dependence on somebody else's harvest. Grain had to come from the Po Valley, or from Puglia, or from Egypt. Timber came down from the alpine forests of Cadore. Stone came by barge from Istria. Every one of those had to be paid for in something. And the only thing the lagoon produced in quantity was the one thing the mainland could not do without. Come down the Zattere on the southern edge of the city, past the customs point where the Grand Canal meets the Giudecca. You reach a row of long, low buildings. Most visitors walk past them without a glance. 9 warehouses, built in the early 15th century. Plain brick, industrial, almost windowless. The floors were reinforced to a specification no other building in Venice needed, because what was stacked inside them was heavy enough to break an ordinary floor. These are the Magazzini del Sale, the salt warehouses. At their fullest, they held tens of thousands of tons. Salt seems like a small thing now. It sits on a table. It costs almost nothing. For most of recorded history, it was the difference between a village that survived winter and a village that did not. Without salt, you cannot preserve meat. Without salt, you cannot cure fish, which means no trade in fish beyond a day's walk from water. No salted provisions means no army in the field for more than a few weeks, and no ship crossing open sea. Salt cures leather. Salt sets dye in cloth. Salt keeps cheese. A city without a salt supply is a city with a fixed and very short shelf life. And the lagoon made it for free. The method has not changed in 2,000 years. Cut a shallow basin in the marsh. Let the tide fill it. Close the gate. Let the sun and the wind take the water away, week after week, until what is left in the bottom of the pan is a crust of white crystal that can be raked, dried, and carried. No fuel, no mine, no skilled labour beyond a man with a rake and a good sense of weather. By the late 12th century, the lagoon held around 119 working salt works. 2/3 of them clustered at the southern end, around Chioggia, where the flats are broadest and the summer sun is longest. Here is where the story turns, and where it stops being about salt at all. Because Venice looked at 119 salt works and eventually shut most of them down. The Republic worked out something that took other states another 5 centuries to learn. Producing a commodity is the low-margin end of the business. Controlling who is allowed to sell it is where the money is. So Venice stopped competing on production and started competing on access. It went to war over salt pans it had no intention of operating. In 1234, it forced a settlement on Ravenna that banned the great salt works at Cervia from shipping a single grain northward, and then patrolled the Adriatic with galleys to enforce it. At Muggia and Capodistria, up the Istrian coast, it took a cut of about a tenth of everything produced. The locals could keep the other 9/10 on one condition. They were forbidden to move it by sea, overland only, which meant slow, expensive, and confined to a few valleys. A market of villages instead of a market of nations. As late as 1578, more than 3 centuries into this, Venetian crews were still destroying the saltworks at Trieste. And then came the part that turns a monopoly into an engine. The Republic paid its own merchants to import salt. Not a tax, a subsidy. A shipowner who landed salt at Venice collected roughly 8 ducats a ton from the state treasury. The state then taxed the same salt on its way out of the city and sold it inland at something close to 33 ducats a ton. The state's profit is obvious. The merchant's profit is where it gets interesting. Because that subsidy did not really pay for salt, it paid for the voyage. A Venetian galley sailing home from Alexandria or Acre or Cyprus was going to make the crossing anyway. Under the rule of 1281, it came back carrying salt in the bilges as ballast. Weighted.
Needed in the hull regardless. No weight the treasury would pay it to carry.
The freight cost of the entire return leg was covered before a single sack of pepper was unloaded, which meant a Venetian merchant could sell spices in Milan, or Augsburg, or Bruges at a price a Genoese merchant could not match without losing money. The cheapest cargo in the Mediterranean was quietly paying for the most expensive one. Venetians themselves paid dearly for salt. They did not object. High salt at home bought the spice trade abroad, and the spice trade abroad bought everything else. When harvests failed on the Italian mainland, the Republic reached into the same fund. Salt revenue underwrote emergency grain purchases from across the Mediterranean, which Venice then sold into a starving market at whatever price it chose. The city that could grow nothing became the city that decided what the mainland would eat. Until the 14th century, the office that managed all of this, the Salt Chamber, was among the most powerful financial bodies in the Republic. Salt money paid for docks, for dredging, for the fabric of the palaces going up along the Grand Canal. The most beautiful street in Europe was funded by a preservative. Follow a single grain of it, because the whole Venetian system is visible in that one object. It begins as seawater in a shallow pan on the mudflats near Chioggia, or on a salt pan the Republic held in Cyprus, or on the Pulian coast, in Sardinia, in Crete. Because as the empire grew, Venice acquired saltworks the way a later age would acquire oil fields. It is raked, dried, and carried in sacks to a great galley returning from the east. It crosses the Adriatic as ballast, paid for by the treasury of the state that will sell it. It is unloaded on the Zattere into a warehouse with floors built to carry the weight of a hill. From there, it goes up the Po by barge, and up the Adige, and over the passes into southern Germany, and it becomes ham, and cured fish, and tanned hide, and cheese wrapped for a winter. It cost the lagoon nothing but sunlight. It bought an empire. And when the price finally broke, it broke for reasons no Venetian could reach. Atlantic and Baltic producers came online at scale. Rock salt was mined inland, and by around 1600, the Adriatic had simply become too busy. Too many hulls, too many flags, too many ports, for any fleet to police a monopoly by force anymore. The white crystal stopped being scarce. And a monopoly on something that is not scarce is just a warehouse. Salt gave Venice a cargo. It did not, by itself, give Venice the Mediterranean. That came from a document. In May of 1082, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos was losing a war. Norman armies under Robert Guiscard had crossed the Adriatic and were driving into his western provinces, and the imperial navy was in no condition to stop them. Venice had ships. Alexios had no money. So he paid in something that cost him nothing that year, and everything afterwards. The document is called a chrysable, a golden bull, named for the imperial seal hung from it. Its terms were simple enough to state in a sentence. Venetian merchants would trade anywhere in the Byzantine Empire without paying the commercion. The commercion was the standard imperial customs duty. 10% of the value of the goods charged on entry and on exit, and it was the backbone of imperial revenue. Greek merchants still paid it. Genoese and Pisan merchants still paid it. Venetians, from that year on, did not. 10% does not sound like a weapon. On a single cargo, it is a nuisance. Applied every year to every hull across an entire empire against competitors who cannot avoid it, it is not an advantage. It is a wall. Venice was also given a permanent wharf and market quarter on the Golden Horn, in the richest trading city in the Christian world. A Venetian ship could dock at its own quay, in its own district, unload without duty, and sell into a market its rivals reached at a 10% handicap. Alexios bought a fleet for a season. He sold the customs revenue of his empire in perpetuity. His successors understood exactly what had happened. John Komnenos refused to renew the terms in 1118 and tried to shift imperial favour to Pisa and Genoa instead. The Venetian response was to raid Byzantine shipping until the privileges were restored. That pattern repeated for the next century. Every time the empire tried to claw back the exemption, its own coastline paid for it. It is worth being plain about what moved through those tax-free holds, because the ledgers were not sentimental, and neither should we be. Venice bought and sold human beings. They were taken from the Balkan coast and later from the Black Sea. Circassians, Tartars, Georgians, Bulgars. They were carried through the lagoon and sold on to Egypt and the Levant, where a Mamluk state was buying young men to fill its armies. Venice was condemned for it repeatedly by Rome. Popes issued prohibitions. The trade continued. It was not a shameful secret in the accounts. It was a line item, taxed and recorded like alum or wax. A city that would later be admired for its tolerance made part of its early fortune selling people into slavery to fund a war against the people it was selling them to. Cross the Grand Canal at the Rialto and look at the building on the eastern bank, just north of the bridge. It is enormous, square, and almost aggressively plain. A courtyard block with arcades on the water and rooms stacked around the sides. It is called the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the warehouse of the Germans. And the question worth asking is not what it was for. It is why the merchants of Nuremberg and Augsburg and Vienna were legally forbidden to stay anywhere else. German traders coming south over the Brenner brought silver, copper, fustian cloth and iron, and they came for spices, silk, cotton, and dyes. They were among the most valuable customers Venice had. By law, from the 13th century, every one of them had to lodge in this single building. They ate here, slept here, stored their goods here, and did all their business here, under the eyes of Venetian officials assigned to the premises. They could not sell directly to each other. They could not go around the city looking for a better price. Every transaction had to pass through a licensed Venetian broker, and the state took its cut of every one. It looks like control. It was also, oddly, a service. A German merchant arriving in a foreign city with a mule train of silver has a problem. He does not know who to trust. In the Fondaco, he did not need to. The warehouse was guarded. The scales were certified. The broker was licensed and liable. Contracts made inside the building were enforceable in Venetian courts, and Venetian courts were famous for enforcing them. The Republic had turned the reduction of risk into a product and charged rent on it. That is the shape of the whole Venetian economy, and it is not the shape most people expect. Venice was never simply a city of merchants. It was a city that sold merchants the conditions under which trade was possible, and took a percentage. Which brings us to the ground the whole thing stood on. Cross to the Rialto market in the early morning. The fish are being laid out on marble slabs. The crates are still coming off the boats, and you are standing in what was, for 3 centuries, the financial center of Europe. Not a metaphor, the actual center. The bankers sat outdoors, at benches, under the arcades near the church of San Giacomo. There was no marble hall. A Venetian bank was a table, a ledger, and a man with a reputation. The word we use for a failed bank still comes from that arrangement. A broken bench. Banca rotta. 3 things were invented or perfected in this square, and each one outlived the Republic by centuries. The first was a contract called the colleganza. Here is how it worked. A wealthy man in Venice who had no wish to spend 8 months at sea put up the capital for a voyage, commonly 3/4 of it. A younger man with little or no money put up the remainder and, more importantly, put up himself. He sailed. He did the buying and the selling in Alexandria or Acre or Tana. He came home. The profits were then split, often down the middle. Read that again, because it is the most consequential sentence in Venetian history. A man with no capital and no collateral could put up his labor and his nerve and come home owning half the profit on a cargo he could never have afforded to buy. The investor's exposure was limited to the money he had put in. The risk was shared, and a single successful voyage could move a family 2 full rungs up the social ladder in 1 season. That contract is the direct ancestor of the joint stock company. It is where limited liability begins. And it did something to Venice that no other Italian city managed at that scale. It made the fortune reachable. Men rose. Men also fell. Long-distance trade in the 12th century was a business where one storm or one pirate could erase a dynasty. But the churn ran in both directions, constantly, and a merchant class that could be entered from below is a merchant class that keeps generating new merchants. Remember that. There was a contract in this city that let a man with nothing become a man with everything. it will matter enormously later when it is taken away. The second invention was the money itself. In 1284, Venice struck a gold coin called the ducat, 3.5 grams and just under 24 carats, as close to pure gold as the period could refine. What made it remarkable was not the metal, it was the discipline. For roughly 500 years, through wars, plagues, sieges, and the loss of half an empire, the Republic did not debase it. The ducat of 1284 and the ducat of the 1700s contained essentially the same gold. Almost every state in Europe debased its coinage when it needed money. Shaving the silver was the oldest tax there was. Venice, which needed money constantly, refused. Because a coin that never lies becomes something more useful than a coin. It becomes a unit of account for everybody else. Contracts in Cairo and Bruges and Constantinople were written in ducats by parties who had never seen Venice, because it was the one number in the Mediterranean that meant the same thing this decade as last. The Republic gave up the short-term revenue of debasement and bought the long-term revenue of being trusted. The third invention is the one that would eventually be copied by every government on Earth. Venice ran on forced loans. When the Republic needed to fund a war, it did not simply tax. It assessed its wealthier citizens on the value of their property. Then it required them to lend to the state. 5%, paid twice a year, in March and September. Those obligations were consolidated into a single perpetual fund, the Monte Vecchio. There was no maturity date. The principal might be returned one day, or it might not. The interest simply continued. And then somebody did something clever with a piece of paper. The holdings were made transferable. A citizen compelled to lend the state 1,000 ducats could sell that claim to somebody else. And by the late 13th century, there was a functioning secondary market in Venetian government debt. Quoted prices, rising and falling on the news from the front. That is a sovereign bond market, 400 years before London had one. The numbers tell you what the wars cost. The fund stood at around 154,000 ducats when it was organised. After one round of fighting with Genoa closed in 1299, it was past 500,000. By 1314, it had crossed 1 million. Then 30 years without a major war brought it back down to around 423,000. A state that borrowed, spent, and paid down, publicly on a published schedule, with the accounts open enough that its own bonds could be priced by strangers. And bondholders were protected by an arrangement that would look severe to any modern treasury. Tax revenue reaching the loan office was earmarked. The government kept the first fixed slice each month, and everything above that went to pay interest before the state could touch it. The lenders were paid before the government was, which was less noble than it sounds. The largest holders of Venetian debt were the same families who sat in the Venetian government. They were writing rules to protect themselves from themselves, and it worked, which is why the bonds held their value. One thing the Republic would not do, however, was lend at interest itself, or permit its Christian citizens to. Church law was explicit on usury, and Venice, whatever else it was, remained formally obedient on that point. But an economy of this size cannot run without small credit. A fisherman needs a new net in March and has no money until August. A widow needs to pawn a ring. The Republic had banned the one service its poorest citizens most needed. We will come back to how it solved that. The solution is still standing, in the north of the city, behind a gate. Now walk east, past the Arsenal gates, where 2 stone lions sit facing the water. Behind those walls lay the largest industrial complex in Europe. 60 acres of dry docks, forges, rope walks and workshops, employing as many as 16,000 people at its height. It built galleys on standardized patterns with interchangeable parts, 300 years before anybody used the phrase mass production. When Henry III of France visited in 1574, the workforce assembled a complete galley between his arrival and the end of his dinner. But the interesting thing about the arsenal is not what it built. It is who was allowed to profit from it. The Republic owned the ships. Every great merchant galley on the main routes belonged to the state, and the state did not trade with them. Instead, once a year, the right to sail a specific voyage was auctioned publicly to the highest bidder. A syndicate of merchants would take a galley for the season: the Egypt run, the Syria run, the Flanders run, sail it, trade it, and hand it back. The Republic took its share and maintained the hull. The convoys were called the Mood. They ran, more or less continuously, from 1315 to 1533. Departure dates were fixed by the Senate. A commander appointed by the Senate sailed with them, representing the state in foreign ports. A government that owned the entire merchant fleet and then rented it annually to private citizens who kept the trading profit. And there was a condition attached that mattered more than anything else in the system. A syndicate holding a galley with spare capacity was obliged to carry other merchants' goods, which meant the smallest trader in Venice could put his bale on a state galley. A man with one bale of cloth. No ship, no crew, no insurance, no connections. Carried in a defended convoy at a regulated rate. The Republic had built a machine for turning small men into merchants and bolted it to a shipyard. Hold that thought too, because the day that access closed is the day this story turns. Most people who come to Venice come, in the end, for one square. Piazza San Marco at first light, before the crowds, is one of the quietest places in Italy. The basilica at the eastern end is unlike any other church in Western Europe. 5 domes, gold mosaic running across every interior surface, marble in a dozen colors that do not match. It is usually described as beautiful. It is more accurate to describe it as a receipt. Look at the 4 bronze horses above the entrance. They are Greek or Roman, cast perhaps 18 centuries ago, and they stood for 1,000 years above the starting gates of the Hippodrome in Constantinople. They came here in 1204, in the hold of a Venetian ship. Look at the 2 squat porphyry figures embedded in the corner of the treasury wall, worn smooth by centuries of hands. 4 Roman emperors in an embrace, carved in Egypt around the year 300. Taken from a square in Constantinople in 1204. One of their feet is still in Istanbul, where it was broken off and left behind. Look at the Pala d'Oro behind the high altar. Nearly 2,000 gems and a mass of Byzantine enamel plaques, many of them stripped from churches in that same city in that same year. Look at the columns, the marble facing, the reliefs set into the outer walls at odd heights, fitted wherever they would go. For 3 days in April 1204, an army that had sworn an oath to liberate Jerusalem worked its way through the largest Christian city in the world. They killed in the streets. They stripped the churches, including the greatest church in Christendom. Tombs of emperors were opened for the metal. libraries burned. The Byzantine Empire was restored, in a form, half a century later. It never recovered. 250 years afterwards, when the Ottoman armies arrived at those same walls, faced a shell. And a share of what was carried out of that city was fitted, permanently, into the front of a church on the edge of a lagoon. Several million people a year photograph it. Most have no idea what they are looking at. The most admired building in Venice is a plundered city, reassembled. The bronze horses on the balcony today are replicas. The originals stand inside, out of the weather. They have now been in Venice for 800 years. They were in Constantinople for 1,000. But the empire bought in 1204 was never the point. The point was what the empire allowed Venice to carry. Sail south and east from the lagoon, past Corfu, past Crete, and after 3 weeks you reach the mouth of the Nile. Alexandria was where the two halves of the world met, and neither one crossed over. Pepper grew on the Malabar coast of India. Cinnamon came from Ceylon. Nutmeg and cloves came from a handful of islands in eastern Indonesia, so small and so specific that for centuries no European knew where they were. All of it moved west by Arab and Indian shipping across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, then overland by camel to the Nile, then down the Nile to Alexandria. And there it stopped. Christian merchants did not sail the Red Sea. Muslim merchants did not carry cargo into Christian Europe. Alexandria was the seam, and Venice owned the European side of it. Consider what happens to a price along that route. A sack of pepper leaving Malabar is worth perhaps a few grams of silver. By the time it has crossed an ocean, paid the Sultan's duty in Egypt, crossed the Mediterranean in a Venetian hull, and been weighed on the Rialto, it is worth many times that. By the time it reaches a kitchen in Nuremberg, it has passed through 5 or 6 sets of hands, and every one of them has taken a margin. Venice took its margin at the single most valuable point in the chain, the last crossing before the money, and the only crossing it controlled outright. The scale is easy to underestimate, so here is one year. It is 1496. 4 great galleys come in from Alexandria and tie up at the Rialto. Between them, they are carrying 2 million kilograms of spice. Nearly 1 1/3 million kilograms of it is pepper. 2,000 tons of seasoning, arriving in a single season, in a city of perhaps 120,000 people. This is the peak. Nobody standing on that quay knows it. Venice at this moment is the clearinghouse of Europe. The German silver comes down the Brenner and goes into the Levant. The pepper comes up from Alexandria and goes north. Cotton from Syria, silk from Persia, sugar from Cyprus and Crete, alum for the dyers of Flanders, glass from Murano that no one else can make because the glassmakers are forbidden by law to leave the lagoon. And every one of those trades passes through a system built on the same 3 things. A cheap cargo that paid the freight, a tax exemption bought a century before anyone alive could remember, and a contract that let poor men become rich ones. Sail 2 more days south from Alexandria's latitude, and you reach the island the blind Doge bought for 1,000 marks. Crete, Candia to the Venetians, was the hinge of the whole system. Every galley running to Egypt or Syria stopped there. It grew wheat when the lagoon needed wheat. It made a sweet fortified wine, Malvasia, that sold across northern Europe at prices no local wine could reach. Its salt pans fed the monopoly. Its harbours sheltered the fleet. For 4.5 centuries, it was the most valuable single asset Venice owned. It was also a colony, run as colonies are run. Venetian landholders were settled on Cretan land. Greek Orthodox worship was subordinated to a Latin church. There were revolts, a dozen serious ones, and they were put down. The Ottomans landed in 1645. The capital held out for 21 years. The siege of Candia is among the longest in recorded history. 2 decades of tunnels, mines, countermines, and disease fought street by street. All of it paid for with money Venice did not have, to keep a garrison alive at the far end of the sea. It surrendered in 1669. The terms allowed the defenders to walk out. An island purchased in a tent in 1204 for the price of
a good house, and defended in 1669 at a cost that helped break the Republic's finances for a generation. It was not the only thing going. Modon and Coron, the 2 fortified harbours at the foot of Greece, the Venetians called them the 2 eyes of the Republic because a fleet without them was a fleet sailing blind, were lost in 1500. Negroponte had gone in 1470. Cyprus, with its sugar and its salt and its cotton, fell in 1571. Zara, on the Dalmatian coast, the town the Crusaders had been made to storm in 1202 as a down payment, changed hands more times than anyone kept count of. Corfu held. It held every time, which is why Venice held the mouth of the Adriatic to the very end. Now go north, into Cannaregio, along a canal that tourists rarely follow, and you come to a small square surrounded by buildings that are taller than anything else in Venice. 6 and 7 stories, with low ceilings, because the people who lived here could not build outward. On the 29th of March, 1516, the Venetian Senate decreed that every Jew in the city would live in this one enclosed place. It had been the site of a copper foundry. The Venetian word for the foundry was ghetto. That is where the word comes from. This square is the original. And the reason it exists is the problem we left on the Rialto. The Republic had forbidden its Christians to lend at interest, and the Republic still needed lending. The arrangement had been running for over a century by then. After the war with Genoa emptied the treasury in the 1380s, Venice granted its first condotta, a formal charter permitting Jewish bankers to lend money in the city. Every term was set by the state. How many banks could open, what rate they could charge, what tax they would pay for the privilege. The charter ran for a fixed period and then had to be bought again, and the renewal fee was calculated to absorb most of what the community had earned in the years since the last one. They were barred from the guilds, barred from owning land, barred from most crafts and every public office, which left pawnbroking, dealing in second-hand goods, medicine, printing, and the long-distance trade with the Ottoman lands. The gates were locked at sunset by Christian watchmen, whose wages the community was required to pay. Outside the walls, a yellow hat or badge was compulsory, and the pawn shops themselves, which the whole arrangement supposedly existed to profit from, were run at rates so tightly capped that they barely broke even. The Republic did not want a profitable lending business. It wanted a cheap one, available to its own poor at somebody else's expense, and a community it could tax at will for for the right to provide it. Confinement was not a religious impulse that happened to have a financial side. The financial side was the design. Inside those walls, over the next 2 centuries, 5 synagogues were built, one above another in the upper floors of ordinary houses, because there was no ground left to build on. A Hebrew printing industry grew here that supplied congregations across Europe. The gates came down in 1797, when the Republic itself did. In the summer of 1501, a banker in Venice sat down with his diary. His name was Girolamo Priuli. He was 25, from an old family, and he had chosen a life of business and observation over public office. His diaries survive, and they are among the clearest records anyone left of a city watching its own position change. The news that reached him had come up from Lisbon. It is 1501. A Portuguese fleet has returned from India. It did not go through Egypt. It did not go up the Red Sea, or overland by camel, or down the Nile to Alexandria. It sailed south around the whole of Africa, into the Indian Ocean, and bought pepper at the source. There is no sultan's duty on that route. There is no Alexandria. There is no Venice. Priuli writes that this matters more than the entire war with the Turks. He writes that he can see the ruin of the city in it, that if the traffic stops, the money stops, and the money is the foundation everything here is built on. He was not being dramatic. He was doing arithmetic. 2 years later, on his second voyage, Vasco da Gama came home with 1,700 tons of spice in his holds. That single fleet carried roughly what Venice had been importing in an entire year. The Venetian galleys that sailed to Alexandria in the seasons that followed found the warehouses thin and the prices wrong. The Republic understood. In January of 1506, the Senate passed a resolution stating plainly that commerce had fallen to the worst condition it had known, and appointed a committee of 5 men to do something about it. And here is the strange part, the part that gets left out of the story almost every time it is told. Venice recovered. The Portuguese could reach India, but for most of the 16th century they could not hold the whole flow. The old route through Egypt and the Levant reopened. By the middle of the century, spices were moving through Alexandria again in real volume, and Venetian merchants were buying them again. The city that Priuli expected to see ruined by 1510 was still, in 1570, one of the wealthiest places in Europe. So the sea route did not kill Venice. What it did was remove the exemption. For 400 years, Venice had held a position no competitor could get around. After 1503, for the first time, there was a way around. And a city whose entire fortune had been built on being unavoidable now had to compete. It did for a while, and it competed well. 16th century Venice became the leading industrial city in Italy. The woolen workshops expanded until the city was producing more than 25,000 cloths a year at the peak. Silk weaving grew alongside it. Printing, glass, soap, sugar refining, shipbuilding. A manufacturing economy assembled on top of the old trading one. Then it came apart, over about 50 years, for reasons that had nothing to do with any single event. English and Dutch cloth arrived in the Mediterranean, lighter and cheaper, and sold into markets Venice had supplied for 2 centuries. Marseille merchants pushed into Alexandria and Istanbul and took the cotton and silk business.
Venetian guilds held their wages and their standards, which protected quality and priced the product out of the market. By the end of the 17th century, the wool output of the city had fallen to a fraction of what it had been. And in 1630, the plague came through the lagoon and killed roughly a third of the people in it, around 46,000, in a city of 140,000. The workshops that survived could not find the hands to restart. So the capital went somewhere else. Take the boat up the Brenta Canal, west of the lagoon, and the landscape changes into something that has nothing to do with the sea. Villas. Dozens of them, running along the water, white and porticoed, and set back behind gardens. Palladio designed some of them. The rest were built by men copying Palladio. They were not holiday houses, whatever they became later. They were the head offices of agricultural estates. From about 1500 onward, Venetian families began moving their money out of ships and into land. They drained marsh on the mainland. They planted maize and rice. They took rents. It was a rational decision made by rational people. Trade returns had become uncertain. Land returns were modest, but they were steady. Nobody wrote a memo announcing the end of the Maritime Republic. A few hundred families simply, over 3 or 4 generations, changed what they invested in. And that is when the world began to see Venice differently. Because this is the century in which Venice becomes a subject rather than a power. The painters arrive. The city fills with visitors on the Grand Tour. Canaletto sells views of the Grand Canal to English gentlemen. And in the background of those paintings, there are merchant galleys that he clearly finds less interesting than the light on the water. The world decided that Venice was beautiful at almost exactly the moment Venice stopped being profitable. Those two things are related, and not in the way people usually assume. The beauty was always there. It was the byproduct. It only became the headline when there was nothing louder to say. Which leaves the question this whole story has been circling. If it was not the Portuguese, and it was not the Turks, and it was not the plague, what actually ended it? The answer is, in a room. And the date is much earlier than anyone expects. Go back to the Palazzo Ducale on the water at the edge of Piazza San Marco and up the stairs to the largest room in the building. The Sala del Maggior Consiglio is 53 meters long and 25 wide, with no columns holding up the ceiling. The largest unsupported hall in Europe when it was finished. Portraits of the Doges run in a frieze around the top of the walls. This is where the Great Council met. Every man entitled to a voice in the government of Venice sat in this room. It is 1297. The council is considering a procedural motion about its own membership. It is not dramatic. There is no crisis in the chamber, no army at the gates, no speech that anyone bothered to record in full. The motion concerns who is eligible to sit here next year. Under the new rule, any man who has served in the council during the last 4 years is confirmed automatically. Anyone else must be approved by a committee. That is all. It is administration. Over the next 26 years, that rule hardens. The approval process narrows. Eligibility drifts from service to dissent. By 1323, the qualification is no longer what a man has done, it is who his father was. The eligible families are written into a register. The Great Council of Venice has become hereditary. Venetians called it the serrata, the closure. For 600 years, it was read as a constitutional reform, a stabilizing measure. The moment Venice secured the political order that let it govern itself without tyrants or factions for another 5 centuries. Then economists went into the archives and counted. The names of more than 8,000 men elected to the Great Council in the decades before 1297 have been recovered and tabulated. And what the tabulation shows is the opposite of stability. Mobility was rising. New families, men who had made money on a colleganza voyage and had never held office before, were winning seats. And the oldest and richest families were losing them. The closure was not the strong consolidating their strength. It was the incumbents noticing they were being overtaken and changing the rules while they still had the votes to do it. And the political closure did not stay political. Within a decade of 1323, it had spilled into the economy. The auctions for the great galleys, the mood, the system built so that any man with a bale of cloth could buy his way into a voyage, were progressively closed to families outside the register. The most profitable routes became the property of a defined list of houses. Those houses then married one another in a dense and deliberate network traced across nearly 7,000 marriages over the following 2 centuries, so that the galley trade stayed inside the group. And the colleganza, the contract that had let a man with nothing come home owning half a cargo, fell out of use. It was replaced by long-term partnerships between established family firms. The door was not slammed, it was allowed to close. Consider what that actually removed. Venice had never had land, or metal, or grain, or timber, or numbers. What it had was a mechanism for finding talent. A young man with no money and a good head could sail on somebody else's capital. If he read a market correctly, he came home rich. And his sons entered the room where the decisions were made. Every generation, that machine ran, and it produced new merchants, hungry, mobile, and better than the ones before them. After 1323, it produced heirs. The empire stayed, the ducat stayed, the arsenal kept building galleys, and the salt kept coming in as ballast, and the pepper kept arriving from Alexandria for another 200 years. But the thing underneath all of it had been switched off. The reason there was always another Dandolo, another Priuli, another syndicate willing to stake a fortune on a cargo. It was shut down from the inside, quietly, in a procedural vote, by men protecting their own seats. When da Gama rounded the Cape in 1498, Venice needed exactly what it had always had: a supply of people who could see a new route and build a new business around it. By then, it had spent 200 years selecting for something else. A city built on mud bought half the Mediterranean. It did it with salt it did not mine, ships it rented out, a tax exemption it acquired in someone else's war, and a contract that let poor men gamble on the sea. And then it decided who was allowed to be rich, and stopped being able to make anyone new. The Republic lasted another 474 years after the register closed. It ended on a spring day in 1797. Napoleon's army was on the mainland. The last Doge, Ludovico Manin, put the question to the Great Council in that same hall. And the council voted to dissolve itself and hand the city over. Manin took off the linen cap worn beneath the ducal crown, handed it to his servant, and said he would not be needing it again. "1,100 years of the Republic ended without a shot fired in the lagoon. The French took the bronze horses to Paris. They came back 18 years later.
Venice today lives on the same thing it has always lived on. Something arrives across the water, and the city charges for access to it. The cargo has changed. In 1951, the historic centre held 174,808 residents. In 2025, it held 47,625. Tourism now accounts for something on the order of €1.5 billion of the city's economy. There are more than 1,200 hotels within the municipality. The bakeries that made bread for a neighbourhood make it for a queue. The apartments that housed families house arrivals. The city that could not feed itself in the 9th century still cannot feed itself, and still does not need to. What is easy to miss, standing in the crowd in Piazza San Marco, is that none of this is new. Venice has always been a city that lived off people who came from somewhere else. It sold them salt and shelter and safe contracts and pepper and glass and the certainty of a coin that meant what it said. Now it sells them 3 days and a photograph. The mechanism is identical, only the inventory changed. Perhaps what matters is not that the fortune ended, every fortune ends, but where it actually went. It did not sink. It did not sail away around Africa. It was not taken by an empire or a plague. It was closed off in a quiet vote, in a room with no columns, by men who had done very well and wanted to be certain their sons would do the same. They got what they asked for. Their sons did do the same. Their grandsons did the same, and their great-grandsons. And each generation was a little less able to see a new ocean when one appeared. The mud is still there, under everything. Under the palaces, under the basilica, under the square. Millions of wooden piles driven into a swamp 800 years ago, holding up a city that once decided the price of dinner in half of Europe. The ground was never the problem. It was never even the point. Thank you for traveling with us. If you would like to keep exploring places like this one, subscribe and stay a while. Until the next journey.